At the Battle of Watling Street, in the year 61, a Roman general named Gaius Suetonius Paulinus did something that, by every rule of warfare, should have ended in annihilation. He took roughly 10,000 legionaries and deliberately backed them into a narrow gorge with a forest at their rear, sealing off their own escape. Across the open ground in front of them stood the army of Boudica, the Iceni queen, by ancient accounts, more than 200,000 warriors, drunk on the sack of 3 Roman cities and the slaughter of tens of thousands. Paulinus had cornered himself on purpose. Within a few hours, the field was carpeted with the British dead, and the Roman line had barely moved. So how does an army trap itself against a wall and walk away the winner? That is the question that runs underneath nearly every strange thing the Roman war machine ever did. Because the tactics that look insane from a distance, the ones that read like suicide on paper, were almost never gambles. They were engineering. Today, I am going to walk you through the Roman moves that looked like madness and worked anyway, and I am going to show you exactly why each one functioned in the dirt and blood of a real battlefield, not just in theory. Here is what I am going to lay out for you. First, why a wall of overlapping shields, the testudo, could march men straight into a hailstorm of arrows that should have killed them and come out the other side. Second, why Roman soldiers carried a spear designed to ruin itself the instant it was thrown, and why that self-destruction was the entire point. Third, how a single rotating line let a tired legionary step out of a fight, walk to the back, and rest while the man behind him stepped into his place, without the formation ever breaking. Fourth, how Julius Caesar, surrounded at Alesia by 2 enemy armies at once, chose to build a second wall facing outward and trapped himself between them on purpose. And fifth, the one Roman habit that had nothing to do with weapons at all, the thing they did before a single arrow flew that quietly won more battles than any sword ever did. One of these 5 is the move that most people get exactly backwards, and I will tell you which one near the end. I read battlefield accounts and tactical manuals the way other people read crime novels, looking for the decision that everyone else skipped over. The Roman sources, from Polybius to Vegetius to Caesar's own dispatches, are unusually detailed about how the legions actually fought, not just who won. Polybius, a Greek hostage taken to Rome in the 2nd century BC, wrote a long, almost obsessive technical description of the legion because he could not believe how mechanical it was, how a Roman camp was laid out by the same survey lines every night, how a maniple measured its frontage, how the men were paid and punished. Vegetius, writing centuries later in a declining empire, was practically begging his readers to remember the drills that had once made Rome unbeatable, which tells you those drills were a deliberate, teachable system and not some inborn courage. And Caesar wrote his own commentaries in the 3rd person, dry and precise, recording the depth of a ditch and the height of a rampart as carefully as he recorded a victory. So most of what follows is not legend, it is mechanism. And the mechanism is where the strangeness finally makes sense. Let me take you back to the gorge at Watling Street, because Paulinus is the whole argument in a single afternoon. Boudica's revolt had already burned Camulodunum, Londinium, and Verulamium, Colchester, London, and St. Albans, and by the Roman historian Tacitus's account, somewhere around 70,000 Romans and allies had been killed. The rising had a real grievance behind it. The Romans had flogged Boudica and assaulted her daughters after her husband, the client king Prasutagus, died and left his kingdom half to Rome in the hope of protecting his family, only for Roman officials to seize the whole of it. That is why the revolt burned so hot. It was not a border raid, it was a population in fury. Camalodunum, the old Roman colony, had no real walls and was overrun, and its temple of Claudius burned with the defenders inside. Paulinus himself was caught at the worst possible moment, off in the far west of the island, campaigning against the Druid stronghold on the island of Anglesey when the rising broke out behind him. He raced back down the road, reached Londinium, judged he could not hold it with the men he had, and made the cold decision to abandon the city to save the field army. That is the kind of commander he was. He would trade a city for a chance to fight on ground he chose. Paulinus was hundreds of miles from reinforcements with a fraction of the enemy's numbers. The Second Legion, ordered to join him, never even showed up, its acting commander refusing to march, a failure so disgraceful the man later fell on his own sword. By the open logic of the time, Paulinus should have been overrun. A force of 200,000, even a poorly organized one, can simply wrap around the flanks of 10,000 men and crush them from three sides. Numbers do that. They always have. Envelopment is the oldest killing maneuver there is. Hannibal had used it to destroy a far larger Roman army at Cannae a quarter of a millennium before, folding 80,000 legionaries into a pocket and slaughtering them from every direction. Every Roman officer knew Cannae the way a modern soldier knows the worst disaster in his own service's history. Paulinus knew exactly what mass could do to him. So Paulinus refused to give the numbers room to work. He picked a defile, a narrow throat of land with steep wooded slopes pressing in on either side and a forest sealing his rear. Now the 200,000 could not spread out. The width of the battlefield was no longer set by Boudica's army. It was set by the gorge, and the gorge was barely wider than Paulinus's own front line. At the point of contact, the fight was roughly even. A few thousand Britons against a few thousand Romans, again and again, with the rest of Boudica's host stacked uselessly behind, unable to reach the killing edge. Think about what that does to a numerical advantage. If only 4,000 or 5,000 men can physically reach the Roman shields at any moment, then the other 190-odd thousand are not soldiers in that instant. They are a crowd. They cannot stab anyone. They cannot flank anyone. They press forward against the backs of the men in front of them, which actually makes things worse, because the warriors at the front lose the room they need to swing a longsword, the very weapon the Britons depended on. A Celtic blade needs space on both sides. A Roman gladius, short and stabbing, needs almost none. Paulinus had chosen ground that broke his enemy's weapon and rewarded his own. The Britons charged. The legionaries threw their spears, locked shields, and advanced in tight wedges. The dead began to pile up across the mouth of the gorge. And here is the part the chroniclers fixate on. Boudica had parked her camp wagons, full of families come to watch the victory, in a great ring behind her own army. That detail tells you how certain they were of winning. They had brought their wives and children to spectate, the way you might bring your family to see a triumph rather than a battle. When the British line finally broke and tried to flee, it ran straight into its own wagons. There was nowhere to go. The crush that had been pushing them forward now had no release valve behind it, and the retreat became a slaughter pen. Romans advancing in good order into a packed mass of people who could not run, could not fight, could not even fall down. Tacitus claims 80,000 Britons fell that day against a few hundred Romans. The number is almost certainly inflated. Ancient historians routinely exaggerated enemy losses, and Tacitus had every reason to make Paulinus's deliverance look miraculous. The mechanism is not inflated. Paulinus did not win by having more men. He won by removing the enemy's only advantage, space, and forcing a contest of discipline where Rome had no equal. Hold that idea, because it is the secret hiding inside every tactic I am about to describe. The Romans were not stronger, man for man. The average Celtic or Germanic warrior was often taller and physically larger than the average legionary, who tended to be a short, stocky man from the Italian countryside or the provinces. They were better organized, and they spent 2 centuries building machines that converted organization into victory. The strangeness is just what organization looks like when you have never seen it before. To an enemy who fought as a collection of brave individuals, each seeking personal glory, a Roman line that moved as one body, killed without breaking ranks, and rotated fresh men into the fight must have looked less like an army and more like a single enormous animal. That psychological shock, facing something that did not behave like men should behave in a fight, is part of why the legions won before the killing even started. Start with the testudo, the tortoise. Picture a block of legionaries closing ranks until they are nearly shoulder to shoulder. The front rank holds their shields forward. The men inside and behind raise theirs flat overhead, edges overlapping like roof tiles, and suddenly an entire unit disappears under a continuous shell of wood and iron. The Roman shield that made this possible, the scutum, was itself a piece of engineering most people overlook. A large curved rectangle around a meter tall, built from thin layers of wood glued in alternating grain directions, essentially ancient plywood, then faced with linen and leather and rimmed and bossed with iron. It was light enough to hold overhead for long stretches and tough enough to take a direct hit. It looks absurd. The men can barely see. They shuffle forward slowly, blind, packed so tight that a single trip could ripple through the whole formation. Every instinct says this is how you get a unit massacred. It is, in fact, how you survive the one thing that terrified infantry more than anything else: the arrow storm. When the Romans assaulted a fortified position or marched into the open against an enemy like the Parthians, who fought almost entirely with horse archers, the air filled with arrows falling at a steep angle. The Parthians are the perfect example of why this mattered, because in 53 BC at the Battle of Carrhae, they annihilated a Roman army under Crassus, one of the richest and most powerful men in Rome, precisely by refusing to close and instead pelting the legions with arrows for hours, resupplying from camel trains of spare ammunition so the storm never let up. Tens of thousands of Romans died or were captured in the desert because they had no answer to a sky full of arrows in the open. A man holding his shield in front of his body is naked from above. The testudo answered that by turning the unit into a single armored roof. Arrows that should have found shoulders and skulls instead clattered off overlapping shields and slid away. Roman accounts describe testudo formations so solid that men could walk across the top of them, and there are records of the formation being demonstrated in the arena, with horses and even a light chariot driven over the shield roof to show how rigid it was. The cost was speed and vision, which is exactly why the testudo was never used in a pitched melee where you need to see and swing. A testudo caught by heavy cavalry or determined infantry in the open could be a disaster because the men inside could barely strike back. It was a delivery system, a way to carry living men intact across the deadliest 50 meters on the field, right up to the foot of a wall where the shell would suddenly open and the assault would begin. The move that looks like a death trap was actually the safest way to cross open ground under fire that the ancient world ever devised. First loop closed. Now look at the spear the legionary threw before he ever drew his sword, the pilum. And here is the strangest piece of engineering in the entire Roman kit, because the pilum was deliberately built to break. The weapon had a long, thin iron shank, a slender neck of soft metal, often something like 2 feet of it, tipped with a small, hardened pyramid point, all mounted on a heavy wooden shaft, the whole thing weighing a couple of kilograms and thrown from perhaps 15 to 30 meters. That weight matters because a heavy javelin carries enormous momentum into a small point. When a soldier hurled it, the narrow point punched clean through a shield or through armor. And then the soft iron neck behind the point bent, sometimes folding over at a sharp angle the instant it struck. Some accounts credit the reformer Gaius Marius around 100 BC with refining the design, replacing one of the iron rivets that fixed the head to the shaft with a wooden pin that would snap on impact, so the weapon broke apart by design rather than by luck. To a modern eye, a spear that bends on impact sounds like a defective weapon. It was the opposite. Think about what happens to an enemy when a pilum punches through his shield and the shaft bends. He cannot pull it out. The bent metal snags. He cannot easily chop it off. The long iron neck keeps the wooden shaft out of reach of his blade. Now he is dragging a 6 or 7 foot pole hanging off the face of his shield, fouling his footing, throwing off his balance, banging into the man beside him. In the press of a charging line, where men need to move in unison, a single ruined shield can stagger a whole front. So most warriors simply threw the shield away and fought exposed, which is exactly what the Romans wanted, because the very next thing those exposed men met was a wall of Roman shields and short stabbing swords at arm's length. Caesar describes this happening in Gaul at the battle against the Helvetii. A single Roman volley pinned multiple Gallic shields together where the pila had punched through and bent, and men who could not free themselves from their own gear were cut down or forced to fight unprotected. And the bending did one more thing. It meant the enemy could not snatch up the pilum and hurl it back. A Roman volley could only be used once by the side that designed it. Compare that to a normal spear or javelin, which an enemy could simply pick up off the ground and return, turning your own ammunition into theirs. The weapon that destroyed itself on contact was not a flaw. It was a one-way door. Second loop closed. The third move is the one almost nobody notices because it happens inside the formation rather than in front of it. Ancient battles were not the quick clashes the movies show. A serious engagement could grind on for an hour, 2 hours, longer, and exhaustion, not wounds, was usually what broke an army. A man swinging a shield and a sword in armor is spent within minutes of real fighting. Consider what a legionary was actually carrying: a mail or segmented iron cuirass, a heavy helmet, that large shield held up on one arm, and the constant muscular effort of bracing against the man pushing on the other side of his scutum. Adrenaline burns out fast. The heart rate of a man in close combat spikes to a level you cannot sustain, and once the legs and lungs go, the sword arm goes with them. Fatigue is what gets you killed. So the Romans did something no other ancient army managed to do reliably. They rotated the front line while the battle was still happening. The legion fought in maniples and centuries arranged with deliberate gaps, the famous quincunx, a checkerboard layout with 3 lines, the hastati in front, the principes behind, and the veteran triarii in reserve. The gaps in the front line were covered by the line behind, so the formation looked solid to the enemy, but was actually built with lanes inside it. Through a drilled sequence, the tired men at the very front could disengage, peel back through the ranks, and be replaced by fresh men stepping forward from behind, all without opening a hole the enemy could exploit. Imagine fighting for 10 minutes, then stepping out of the line entirely, walking to the rear, catching your breath, drinking water, while a rested comrade takes your place at the edge of the blades. Then, 20 minutes later, you cycle forward again. The Romans even had a phrase that survives in the language. Matters had come to the triarii, meaning the situation had grown so desperate that the last and most experienced reserve line had finally been committed. The very existence of that proverb tells you how systematic the staged commitment of fresh men was. It was a recognized stage of a battle, not an accident. Now stack that against the enemy facing you. Their front rank fights until it drops, with no relief, because they have no system for swapping men under pressure. A Gallic or Germanic warband fought as a single furious surge, magnificent in the first charge, and increasingly hollow with every minute that the charge failed to break the line. Hour after hour, the Roman line stays fresh, and the enemy line wears down to nothing. They were not out fighting their opponents in any given minute. They were out-resting them across the whole battle. The strangest advantage on the field was that the Romans, in effect, fought the war shift by shift. Third loop closed, and that brings me to the most audacious thing any Roman commander ever did, the move that takes the lesson of the gorge and inverts it completely. In 52 BC, Julius Caesar trapped the Gallic leader Vercingetorix inside the hill fort of Alesia with around 80,000 men. Vercingetorix was no ordinary opponent. He had united the fractious Gallic tribes into something approaching a single national army, and only weeks earlier he had handed Caesar a sharp defeat at Gergovia, the one real bloodying Caesar took in the whole Gallic War. After that, Vercingetorix made the calculated decision to pull his main force into the fortress of Alesia and wait, betting that the combined manpower of Gaul could be raised to come crush Caesar against the walls. Caesar's answer to a siege was to build a wall of fortifications, ditches, ramparts, towers, sharpened stakes, and concealed pits, running roughly 11 miles all the way around the fortress, sealing Vercingetorix in. And these were not crude earthworks. Caesar's own account describes layered obstacle belts in front of the rampart, wide ditches, some flooded by diverting a stream, rows of sharpened branches woven together so they could not be pulled aside, pits with fire-hardened stakes set in the bottom that his soldiers grimly nicknamed lilies, after the flower, because of the way the points peeked up out of the ground, and scattered iron spikes to cripple bare feet and hooves. Standard, brutal, effective. Then, Caesar got word that a Gallic relief army was coming. By the ancient accounts, a force that may have numbered in the hundreds of thousands, though the real figure was surely smaller, marching to crush him from behind while the men inside Alesia broke out from the front. This was the nightmare scenario for any besieger, caught between the garrison and a relief force, with your own backs turned to one enemy whenever you face the other. A normal general retreats. Caesar did the opposite. He ordered his men to build a second complete ring of fortifications, facing outward this time, another wall of stakes and ditches and towers, miles long, encircling his own siege line. The inner wall, the one facing Vercingetorix, the Romans called the contravallation. The outer wall, facing the relief army, the circumvallation. When he was finished, the Roman army was sitting inside a double wall, like the meat in a fortified sandwich, with 80,000 enemies pressing from the inside and a vast relief host slamming into the outside. He had trapped himself on purpose between two armies by choice. and he did it with somewhere around 50,000 men holding 2 walls totaling well over 20 miles of perimeter, stretched almost impossibly thin. It looks like the act of a man who has lost his mind. It was the single most rational decision on the field. By walling himself in, Caesar shrank every fight down to the width of a fortification, exactly the gorge trick applied in a full circle. The Gauls could never bring their overwhelming numbers to bear all at once, because the wall, the ditches, and the hidden stakes funneled them into narrow killing zones where, once again, the contest became a matter of discipline rather than mass. The relief army could only attack where the ground allowed, and Caesar's scouts had read that ground. When the great assault finally came against a weak point on the outer wall, Caesar could see the whole fight from his interior lines and shift reserves to the threatened sector faster than the Gauls could exploit it. The histories describe Caesar himself riding to the breaking point in his distinctive scarlet cloak, leading the last reserves in person and sending cavalry out a gate to take the attacking Gauls in the rear. The inner enemy and the outer enemy could not coordinate cleanly across Caesar's defenses, separated by miles of works and unable to see each other's timing. He fought them in turns, at the points he chose, on ground he had built with his own engineers. Alesia ended with Vercingetorix riding out and laying his arms at Caesar's feet in surrender, and Gaul effectively falling to Rome, a conquest that would feed Caesar's wealth and prestige all the way to his crossing of the Rubicon and the end of the Republic. The man who deliberately surrounded himself won the campaign that decided a continent. So, which of these is the one most people get backwards? It is the pilum, the spear built to bend. Almost everyone who hears about it for the first time assumes it was a manufacturing weakness, a flaw in cheap iron that the Romans simply tolerated. It was the reverse. The bending was the design's specification. They engineered fragility into the weapon on purpose because a spear that ruins one enemy shield forever is worth far more than a spear that bounces off and can be thrown back. Once you see that, you understand the whole Roman mind. They were not chasing the strongest individual weapon. They were chasing the system that produced the best outcome across 10,000 men and 2 hours of fighting. It is the same logic that runs through everything they built, standardized so that any part could be replaced, any soldier slotted into any unit, any tactic taught to a farm boy from the provinces in a few months of drill. The legion was not a collection of heroes. It was a machine designed so that the death or exhaustion or failure of any single part did not break the whole. Every move I have described is the same idea wearing a different costume. Which leaves the fifth promise, the habit that had nothing to do with weapons, the one that quietly won more battles than any sword. It was this. At the end of every single day on campaign, no matter how tired the men were, no matter how safe the country seemed, the Roman army stopped and built a fortified camp. A ditch, an earthen rampart, a wooden palisade, laid out to the same standardized plan every time so that any legionary dropped into any camp in the empire knew exactly where his tent and the gates and the commander stood. The plan was so consistent that the main roads through the camp had fixed names: the Via Principalis, the Via Praetoria, and the commander's tent, the Praetorium, always sat in the same relation to the gates. The men marched carrying the tools to build it. Each legionary hauled stakes for the palisade and a digging tool along with his armor, weapons, rations, and cooking gear, a load that could top 30 kilograms, which is why the soldiers half-jokingly called themselves Marius's mules. It cost hours of brutal labor at the end of a long march. Most armies of the ancient world would have collapsed where they stood, or simply slept in the open and trusted to sentries. But that camp meant the Romans could never be surprised in the night. It meant a defeated legion always had a fortress to fall back into rather than a rout to die in. And most casualties in ancient warfare came not in the fighting, but in the rout afterward, when a broken army turned its back and was cut down from behind. A force that could retreat into a ready-made fort denied the enemy that easy harvest. It meant they could besiege an enemy for months without ever being besieged themselves. And there is a second-order effect that outlasted every battle. Those marching camps, dug and abandoned night after night across the empire, became the seeds of permanent forts, and the permanent forts became towns, and the towns became cities that still stand today. The pattern is even written into the map of Britain, every English place name ending in Chester or Castor, from Manchester to Lancaster to Winchester, comes from the Latin castra, meaning a military camp. The discipline to dig a wall when you would rather sleep is not glamorous. It does not make it into the paintings. But that shovel won more campaigns than the gladius ever did, because the army that cannot be caught off guard and always has somewhere to retreat to simply does not lose the way other armies lose. The strangest Roman tactic of all was the boring one they performed every single evening. Fifth promise paid, and the loop closed. Stand back and look at the whole pattern. The tortoise of shields, the spear that destroys itself, the line that rotates mid-battle, the general who walls himself between two armies, the camp built every night by exhausted men. None of it was reckless. All of it looks insane only because we are looking at the surface of a decision and not the machine underneath. Each one trades away something obvious: speed, the reuse of a weapon, the comfort of a tired man, the freedom to maneuver, an evening's rest, to buy something that wins the whole battle rather than the next minute of it. That is the single thread that ties Watling Street to Alesia to the camp dug at dusk. The willingness to look insane in the short term because you have done the arithmetic of the long term. Rome did not conquer the ancient world by being braver or stronger than everyone else. It conquered by being more organized than anyone had ever imagined an army could be. And then, by turning that organization into tactics so counterintuitive that its enemies never saw the trap until they were already standing in it. Exactly where Boudica's warriors stood, in the mouth of a gorge, against an army that had cornered itself. And won. If you want more of these, the strange decision underneath the famous battle, the mechanism instead of the myth, subscribe and hit the like button so the next one finds you. I will see you in the next one.